So why didn't they use longbows during the Napoleonic Wars? It's an interesting idea because in theory those battlefields would have been the longbows' playground, with thousands of unarmoured troops in tight formations, and on the surface level it seems like the longbow was just far more deadlier than the inaccurate muskets of the time. In terms of performance, the longbow has an effective range of roughly 200 to 300 metres compared to the muskets only around 100, and it still wasn't accurate until the invention of rifling, and it had a greater fire rate of roughly 3 to 4 times per minute than the musket. The sentiment was also shared by British military officer Charles Lee, who in 1792 advocated for the return of the longbow over the musket for the points just mentioned, as well as that the archers don't get blinded by their own smoke when they shoot. An arrow would take a man out of combat if hit, and thousands of arrows raining down on the enemy would absolutely terrify them, disrupting them as they tried to move out the way from them. Our arguments for the longbow though do begin to fall apart, and it's the only reason why the English were the only major adopters of this weapon during the medieval era, despite its overwhelming success at battles such as Agincourt and Crecy, and that is because you needed a lifetime of training to use it, and you needed to be an absolute physical beast in order to maintain its fire rate for a solid few minutes. And of course the English had that training, as in 1363 King Edward III issued a decree that every Sunday every able-bodied man was to practice the longbow, so when the time came that Edward needed a few thousand men to go to war with those cheese munchers across the channel, he'd have a decent sized pool of men to choose from. In comparison, the musket only needed around 3 weeks of training to be competent with, meaning you could raise and replenish larger armies a lot quicker. As well as that, you didn't need the required strength of the longbow to use the musket, so if your army was suffering from poor food supplies and maybe some poor conditions and your soldiers were feeling a bit wary, their performance wouldn't be as impacted as if they were using a longbow. Adding to this, muskets could also perform in poor weather conditions such as heavy rain, whereas that rendered a longbow almost completely useless. And longbows needed a lot more space to operate, whereas muskets you could crouch, go down prone, maybe hold an awkward angle to defend a building. And longbows, while the rain of arrows would have absolutely terrified the enemy, a line of volley gunfire from the muskets would have made you shit your pants. More arguments for our musket propaganda is that the muskets were mass produced compared to a longbow which had to be individually fletched, as well as each arrow being individually fletched, and a musket could turn into a makeshift spear with the addition of a bayonet. Whereas if you were a longbowman, you'd need the longbow and the spear weighing you down further if you were going on long campaigns. It's a fun thought experiment, whereas the longbow is probably deadlier on the battlefield, but the musket is just far more logistically sound overall. And I imagine if the longbow was reintroduced for the battlefield for one go, it would get absolutely fucked by a cannon.